All right, well, welcome everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Margaret McManaway. I'm the Senior Associate Director of the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, and I'm thrilled that you could join us for today's panel on priestly trust, the bishops, and the church to discuss the national study of Catholic priests and to celebrate the academic work of our beloved colleague, Dr. Brooke Tranten. Yeah, exactly. For those of you who might not be familiar with our work, the Nicola Center seeks to share the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition through teaching, research, and public engagement at the highest level and across a range of disciplines. Through our academic research and publications, our Soren Fellow student formation program, and our work to support a culture of life, we grapple with some of the most vexed questions of ethics, culture, and public policy today, projecting Notre Dame's distinctive voice into the public square on issues related to justice, human dignity, and the common good. If you'd like to learn more about our work or to sign up for updates about future events like this one, please visit our website, ethicscenter.nd.edu. Today's discussion is an opportunity for us to reflect upon the state of America's presbyterate almost a year into Pope Leo XIV's papacy. In 2025, the Catholic Project at the Catholic University of America released the findings of its National Study of Catholic Priests, which offered some sobering statistics regarding clerical well-being and episcopal trust. Our panelists have each in their own way contributed to ongoing work and conversations surrounding these critical challenges facing the church, and we're delighted to have them join us here today as they offer their own reflections on the study's findings and possible pathways for renewal moving forward. So to welcome our panelists, Brooke Tranten is Program Coordinator at the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. She holds an MTS from the University of Notre Dame and a doctorate in American History from Marquette University, where her dissertation focused on Reagan-era nuclear policy and the American Catholic bishops. She has contributed articles to Church Life Journal and the academic journal American Catholic Studies. Her contribution to the volume Rebuilding Trust, Clergy Morale in the Wake of the Abuse Crisis, published in 2025 by Catholic University Press, explores the historical roots of today's conversation. Monsignor John Paul Kimes is the inaugural Mark Moritz and Family Memorial Chair of Law at Notre Dame Law School and the Raymond of Peñafort Fellow in Canon Law at the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. He clearly needs more titles. Prior to joining the Notre Dame Law School faculty, he served for 11 years as a canon lawyer at the Vatican's then Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He was ordained in 2000 as a priest of the Maronite Catholic Eparchy of Our Lady of Lebanon of Los Angeles, after having completed his first course of studies at the Pontifical Gregorian University. Last but not least, Father Thomas Berg is a visiting professor of the practice at the McGrath Institute for Church Life. He received his Ph.D. in philosophy from Rome's Pontifical University Regina Apostolorum. A priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Berg served for 13 years as professor of moral theology and a formation advisor at St. Joseph Seminary in Yonkers, New York. He also served 10 of those years as director of seminarian admissions. In addition to his scholarly work in bioethics and moral theology, he has been a sought-after speaker on the clergy sexual abuse crisis and the renewal of Catholic seminary formation. And with that, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Very good. All right. People can hear me. I was a little worried for my microphone, but friends, thank you all for being here. I think just to give you a roadmap of our discussion today, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the national study of Catholic priests and spend about 5 minutes just talking about my chapter in particular. And then I will hand the reins over to Monsignor and we will just have a discussion about the study, about some things that jumped out to Father Monsignor and myself while we were looking through the study and in my own piece. All right, so the National Study of Catholic Priests comes out 2022. All of the research, all of the work was done in 2020 and 2021. So you'll notice the context is within a few years after the McGrath crisis, after different apostolic visitations around the world, and not more than a few meetings in Rome. And I believe for you sociology people here, I had a handy dandy cheat sheet that will give you some of the actual numbers. So we're not just talking vagaries here. So it looks like the poll was conducted by Gallup. Around 10,000 priests in the United States were contacted. That's both diocesan and religious. And there was about a 36% response rate, which the sociologists tell me is representative, so a very good response. And out of those, about 100 in-depth interviews, in-person interviews were conducted with different priests, some of whom in this room might be responsible for some of those interviews. Our Soren Fellow, Caitlin Fitzgerald, who's joining us. And in addition, there was a census taken of all American bishops with a 67% response rate. So you're looking at about probably 150 or so bishops have responded to this. And the questions that were asked of the priests in the study, with some modifications, were also asked of these bishops. This is the largest study of the Catholic priesthood in the United States in 50 years, perhaps even ever. Different studies have been conducted, notably in the 90s and in the early 70s, immediately after sort of the implementation of the liturgical books of the Second Vatican Council. So I'll give you a general idea of the three main findings of the study. So the study is looking at levels, it's looking at a few different things. One is a general consensus of flourishing. Are priests doing well? Are they feeling good about their lives? Are they feeling good about their ministry, both as ministers and as people? That's based on the Harvard Flourishing Index, which is kind of a standard in social studies of how to measure somebody's well-being or their happiness. And clergy are scoring around an 82 out of 100 points on the flourishing scale. So that is quite high, and about 10 points higher than the general population. So good news there. And another thing, number two in the study, younger priests are found in all metrics to be more politically conservative and theologically conservative than priests before them. Especially, you start seeing the spike of men self-reporting being either conservatively or theologically conservative after about the year 1995, according to ordination date. So I know we have, for those of us who have been around the church for any period of time, we kind of have the idea in our heads that, the younger priests are the more conservative, are the more smells and bells types, that sort of thing. It looks like the data backs this up by and large. And according to the study, the gap is continuously widening between older priests and younger priests, those in their 60s and those in their 60s and 70s, and those in their 40s or younger. And I think the third thing in this study that is particularly, at least sobering for me, is there's very low trust in bishops, self-reported. So the question actually was, do you yourself have trust in the leadership ability of your bishop or religious superior? So we have both questions for both diocesan and religious. Diocesan priests said they have a 49% trust in their bishops, as in, I have a great deal of trust in my bishop, so less than half. Some might say to be expected after the sex abuse crises of the 2000s and 2010s. This is the lowest it has ever been. This question has been replicated in 2 different studies previously. And that number goes up to 67% for religious, which is, something that might merit more thought. Also, in comparing the relationship between bishops and priests, the question was asked of both bishops and priests, how do you perceive your relationship with your bishop? What label would you give it? And they were given a number of nomenclatures, right? Do you consider yourself a brother to your bishop? Do you consider your bishop to be a shepherd? And the question was replicated vice versa. So about 29% of priests say they consider their bishop a brother in ministry. About 73% of bishops consider themselves to be brothers to their priests. So that's bad. What we're seeing is an incredible disconnect in the way bishops think of themselves in relation to their priests and the way priests think of themselves in relation to their bishops. And I guess the fourth thing in the study is a concern about diocesan policy surrounding sexual abuse surrounding the Dallas Charter. Mostly, the numbers are pretty stark. What priests would say, would their diocese support them if they had been falsely accused of sexual abuse? About 36% of diocesan priests said their bishop would support them if they were falsely accused. About 85% of religious said the same. So again, we're seeing a massive disparity in diocesan and religious priests, and priests' perception that if something were to happen to them, if they were falsely accused, notice this is falsely accused, there wouldn't be any help for them. And the roots of that, the study, asking these priests and doing some more research into this, and I think Father Kimes has certainly some expertise in this area. Priests are primarily concerned about the broadness of the term vulnerable adult or vulnerable individual when it comes to diocesan policy and adjudicating these issues. There is no set definition. Priests know that, and it's created a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear, according to the study. So, I guess I will speak a little bit about my chapter, and then we can get into it here. So, by way of saying, my chapter in the book is the only historical chapter. The vast majority of folks in the book are working as theologians, canonists, or as sociologists. So they're looking at some of those other factors in the study that are influencing clerical trust that might be more important, but I had to find a way to fit myself into the research, right? So my chapter is called The John Paul II Generation and the Bishops, Historical Account of the High Water Mark of Presbyteral Trust in the Episcopate. So I zeroed in on the question of trust in the leadership ability of the bishops, and I said, all right, I think we all know why it's quite low today because of, successive sex abuse crises. However, I noticed in this question had been replicated twice before, 1985 and 1992. The response given very much or a great deal of confidence in my bishop's leadership. In 1985, that percentage was 53%. All right, great. In 1992, that number goes up to 55%. So you see a little bit of an uptick a few years later. However, in the year 2000, before the long lens of 2002, the Spotlight, Boston Globe series of 2001, we're looking at 63%. So my question was, all right, the papacy of John Paul II, you're seeing a consistent uptick in trust and it reaches its high point in the year 2000. Why is that? Some might think it might be a bit higher in the early part of the 80s, but it looks like it peaks right in the year 2000 when John Paul II has been Pope for 20 years at this point. So I started asking around, why might this be the case? Why are priests self-reporting trusts in such high levels at this point? And when I couldn't find any answers from some of my good friends who might have been young priests or ordained around those years, I knew I had something. And so I started looking at it from a historical point of view and said, all right, so what are the mainstays of John Paul's sort of policy, his modus operandi of dealing with the United States, and what are priests thinking of him at the time? And I noticed there was a remarkable sense, looking back into the research, of number one, longevity, and number two, stability on the part of the Pope and the part of men he made bishops during those years. So priests are perceiving, quite apart from ideology or theological orientation, they're seeing their leadership in the church as being around for a long enough time, as being stable. Even if they might not get along personally with their bishop, that man has been in office for a long enough period of time that he gets to know me as a priest, he gets to learn his presbyterate, and that seeing that stability is very important for clerical well-being and the way they perceive their ministry and themselves. So that's what I was looking at, is number one, sort of the societal things that are going on during the papacy of John Paul II in relation to the United States, World Youth Day, apostolic visitations of seminaries, some other episcopate-related issues happening in the early 80s. And number two, just looking at who are the bishops that John Paul is appointing, and what does that say about his priorities for the United States, and what does that say about the way priests perceive that. So yes, I think I'll turn it over to Monsignor here.
Thank you. Before we get into conversation, I think what would be fascinating to hear from you is, okay, what kind of things were not included, either in your own work or in the study itself? Were there pieces that you think would have been important that weren't included in the study, or in your own research? Is there more data or more information there that you feel would, compel you to write more on this topic?
Yes, I think one thing I was really sad that I had to sort of leave out of the study was I also had access, so we get the full, README Excel file of all of the priest's answers to the questions in the survey. I also had access to all the bishop's answers. And that was incredibly interesting, if only because the identifiers were very obvious in most cases, given the amount of bishops answering and the amount of priests answering. But I did a whole lot of work on breaking down priest answers, especially in relation to theological orientation, how I implement my sex abuse policy in my diocese. I broke that down by age, and I broke that down by year of ordination and year of consecration as bishop. And I found there were some really, really interesting trends amongst younger bishops who would have been, who would at this point be in their early 60s compared to men in their 70s or even their latter 50s. They might identify all of those theological markers and political orientation markers, alongside priests of their age. But the way they're talking about policy, the way they're talking about how they would help their priests, or how available they are to their priests to build relationships, it was remarkably similar to older bishops who are not of that sort of JP2 generation, or tend on the more theologically liberal side, which I am conflating with priests prior to that generation. Why? Because the data simply stacks up that way. So why is that? Why is that? Why is all of a sudden these JP2 generation bishops, they start to kind of, I guess, go back into that certain type of episcopal behavior?
Well, I think one of the things that you mentioned earlier, again, was this notion of you refer to it as a constantly widening gap between younger priests and older priests. And again, since Father Tom and I were both ordained the same year and would probably both define ourselves as quote unquote JP2 priests, given the influence of John Paul II in our own vocations and his theological importance during our years of formation, I would expect that gap to no longer be widening in a certain sense, because I would expect the generation, our generation ordained 25 years, but formed with the theological clarity and vision of John Paul II, to have more in common theologically with seminarians and young priests today. So it begs the question is, are we getting more liberal as we're getting older? Which could, goes to speak to, is there something about the lived experience of the priesthood that makes you appear more, quote unquote, liberal than perhaps you might have been as a younger priest? And is that same, what is going on? And it's likely that same phenomenon is going on in the episcopacy, just in the same way it is in the priesthood. So Father, I don't know if you have any, again, people look at me like I'm a wide-eyed liberal these days, whereas, in seminary, I was, an untouchable conservative. So I don't know whether I've moved or whether everything around me has moved.
I totally share that experience with you. When I was going through seminary, we were ultra conservatives, right? Then when I showed up to start teaching in the seminary in 2011, that's when I learned that I was actually quite liberal. So when I started teaching, with no offense to anyone, millennial seminary. So that's a very interesting point. And now, we do, theologically, yes, we do, and yet we don't. So that's interesting. But I do think the widening out of the difference is probably, though, still in comparison to just a bit older priests than, just before, our JP2 generation, but it is an interesting phenomenon.
But I think again, I don't know that there's an explanation for it other than something happens to you as you live out the priesthood and your exercise of ministry. You're confronting people in their lives and in their most difficult circumstances, and you confront that with theological clarity, but also that pastoral experience, I think, necessarily changes maybe not who you are, but maybe the way that other people perceive you, because they may miss the theological clarity but see a softer touch pastorally. I don't know. I don't have an explanation for it. I just know that it's an experience. I think a lot of our generation of priests is, we all came into seminary on fire with the clarity of John Paul II, and were considered liberals by the faculties that trained us and by the seminarians who were a little older than we were. And 25 years later now, I'm apparently that guy. So I think there's, again, I don't know how you put your fingers around, or put your hands around it, but I think there's something real there.
I think I might know if I could. I think it might be, the through thread I'm seeing is instead of just saying men of your age, but the JP2 generation,
Men of a certain
That-
age.
Their self-identification as conservative and even some progressives, and those are like, that's literally the nomenclature used in the study. I'm not putting labels on it, it's, do you identify as theologically middle of the road, progressive, and politically as well. So those are two different measures, but the wording is the same. They're identifying the same as they had years ago as conservatives. The difference is two things. The men self-identifying as theologically or politically progressive is disappearing. To the extent in the 2025 follow-up study, not a single priest self-identified, men who were ordained after the year 2020, to be fair. Not a single one identified as progressive. Everybody was either middle of the road conservative or very conservative / orthodox. There's that. And then there's also the reality of JP2 generation, middle of the pack age at this point, are becoming bishops now. And from what I've seen from the data and what I know anecdotally, it makes a difference. There's a change happening there, the way I'm identifying, of the way I'm handling issues.
So I think one of the fascinating things that all three of us noticed in the study was, again, the very high levels of flourishing. And again, using a secular standard of the model of flourishing, one that's, generally accepted, as, you indicated earlier. And, my own impression was that there's something askew. There's something askew with the very high number of the identification of flourishing at being 82, which
Father Tom did not like this.
So Brooke, let's start with you, and then we can bring in the much more clerical view of this. But why do you think the numbers are what they are? And do you think that the number is high? Do you perceive the number to be high? Do you perceive it to be low, and what's your explanation for why you think it is what it is?
I think based on what I'm looking at in the research, especially of the JB2 generation younger, these are guys who chose the priesthood for different reasons than older men might have. And you'll look at it in the interviews, men ordained in the 70s, early 80s, why they became a priest. Many of them will say, I like the way priests lived, looked really nice. I went to a Jesuit high school, so, it seems like a decent life. I get to be a part of the community. I get to be a community leader.
I don't have to wash my own clothes.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to wash my own clothes. There you go. It's perfect. Younger men tend to give the answer, the Eucharist is the center of my life. I want to bring that to the people. I want to be a part of the work in the vineyard. And I'm painting with a very broad brush, of course, but those are some of the answers that stood out to me. In the earlier research in the 2000 study in particular, that's actually taken apart a little bit. This was also another Catholic University of America study where the specific cultic dimension of the priesthood is mentioned. The younger priests are very attached to the ritual part of the faith, to saying Mass, to hearing confessions, to adoration of the Blessed Sacrament in a way that older men just weren't. So I think there's that sort of self-sacrificial, that sort of cultic dimension that we see as a mark of identity that men would specifically say in this research in the 92 and the 2000 study. I'm seeing this on the part of my Pope as well, of John Paul II, the self-sacrifice, the sort of dynamic conservatism that, yes, is looking to the past, but is also very much oriented toward the future. And I think that's where some of that comes from when it comes to flourishing, even if the job has gotten progressively harder. This is what I'm seeing as a layperson too. I'm like, these guys they are choosing this knowing, especially after the year 2000, there is no intrinsic societal benefit to being a Roman Catholic priest aside from, love of Jesus Christ, which I'll take that.
Yeah, just a few thoughts on the whole. First of all, I'm glad we're all concerned. I assume we're all concerned about the flourishing of priests. So I guess I share this with Father John Paul. Maybe it's because we also know he and I name anybody who's a priest. You don't have to, and you may, just as laypersons as well, you may well know a lot of priests who wouldn't self-report as flourishing, right? Who are struggling, right? The word would be struggling. Now, it's also important to notice that flourishing and struggling are not, at odds with each other. There's some overlap because obviously, if I'm living a call to redemptive suffering, there is going to be some struggle. I can self-report as flourishing and also have a lot of struggle going on in my life. So I just point to questions about that. I think it's a fascinating question. I think we also know, I certainly do, I know priests who might report that they're flourishing because parish is fine. I've got my day off on Thursdays. I got my golf club. I got boat. And yeah, life is good. My bishop's a jerk, but life's good. I think I could imagine quite a few priests reporting at that level. I think it's a very thin understanding of flourishing, obviously. So I would hope that as priests report that they are flourishing, that they're thickening that with certain things, which I think were reflected in the study. I'm flourishing because of my prayer life. I'm flourishing because of my ministry, especially the cultic element, the celebrating the Eucharist, hearing confessions. I'm flourishing because of the demands that are placed on me in a good way. Being there for my parishioners, being there for my people. So I would just add to that I hope, and I don't know that this was necessarily reflected in there, but I think it's just very important today, and I think it's just very important to have in mind. Yes, priests can be flourishing to some extent, but I'm afraid they might fall short or settle for less at times. And I think the thing where priests need to be encouraged is to be working on the stuff that's going on inside, right? We all have life wounds. We all have stuff going on. I could use a stronger word, but I won't because of this, I think. My brother priests are infamous for not working on that stuff real well. And that's because we're always so busy helping other people work on their stuff, right? So I just think it's important, and a real central part of flourishing is that we're working on our stuff, right? So I can be a priest, I can really in many ways be thriving, except that I've also got this father wound thing that I've never really worked on well, or I seem to be thriving in my life and so on, but I haven't been in spiritual direction in years. I seem to be thriving, things seem to be going well, except that I've got this habit of looking at pornography that's kind of an albatross, and I just can't seem to shake it. So those kinds of things, right? So I just think that hopefully as priests are thinking about flourishing, we're thinking kind of in a thick sense of what it really means to live a flourishing life.
And I think part of that too, you have to know that Father Tom and I have, the work that we do with priests is particular, I would say. So we have, particular experiences.
Of the afternoon.
Well, we have particular experiences too that, again, aside from our priest friends and aside from, other priests and colleagues that we work with, those priests that we minister to, you in particular, we're looking at very wounded priests. So I ask myself constantly, again, with my own perspective and my own experience, how much does that color my expectation for something like this? So that when I saw these numbers of 82%, I used a much stronger word than stuff regarding the false nature of this number. I found it to be incredulous, because, again, my experience of priests is just that they will put their head down and they will say, "It's fine. I have my day off. I have my dog. I've got all of the booze that I need to self-medicate, and the bishop is going to leave me here for the next 7 years, so I know what I have ahead of me. I pay the bills at the end of every month, and that's fine." And unfortunately, I don't want to stereotype that perspective, but it's not an uncommon representation. So my
That could pass as flourishing.
That could pass as flourishing.
Yeah. Among priests.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a little autobiographical there, Monsignor.
No.
These,
I
it's,
don't have a day off.
that's what I mean.
I have the dog and the booze. I do not have a day.
They said it, I didn't. I think, I completely agree, but at the same time, I feel the need to kind of defend the metric. And, maybe Caitlin wants to defend the metric as well in the Q&A, I don't know. The Harvard Flourishing Index is asking, to be fair, very broad questions that has been replicated in previous studies of normal people, not just a priest. And it literally asks things like, how do you rate your physical health on a scale of 1 to 10? And then we do the math and we do the metrics according to that. Would you say, another way of putting it, there was one about how do you perceive your relationships of social support? Would you rate them as good, better, best, scale of 1 to 10? So that's very broad, and this is, maybe now that I'm thinking about it, this is also showing us kind of the poverty of what it means to measure flourishment. We are doing our very best from a sociological perspective to measure what makes people happy or not very depressed. But what does that actually mean? Like Father Tom pointed out, you can say, my social supports are fine, but if I were accused of sex abuse, my bishop definitely didn't help me, and I would be out of the rectory in about 6 hours on the street. And that's a problem. That's a massive problem.
So moving on, one of the things that the study or this book purports as a potential solution to recovering a higher level of confidence or trust between priests and their bishops is the reinvigoration of the idea of spiritual fatherhood. Now, before I throw a flag on the play, why don't you speak to that in as much as it was part of your research? What is that? What do you think that notion of spiritual fatherhood means, and how could that be a tool of reinvigoration of this relationship of trust?
Sure, I think my reaction was much the same as yours, Father Tom's. There's an essay in the book by a priest who works at at St. Luke's Institute, which is an institute specifically dedicated to helping priests, either those accused of sex abuse, alcoholism, pornography addiction, whatever. So doing that sort of work. And his solution is the reinvigoration of the idea of spiritual fatherhood on the part of bishops toward their priests. That, to me, is a very well-intentioned effort. of trying to establish that sort of basic familial or even friendly relationship between priests and bishops that priests certainly are not feeling. They are not identifying their bishops as fathers, as brothers. Another question is, do we want them to? Do we want them to identify their bishops as their fathers? But on the flip side, that is a much larger percentage of bishops are defining themselves that way. Oh, I'm a father to my priest. Okay, how can you be a father to somebody who does not perceive to have that relationship with you? If 65% of bishops are saying that, and then 20% of priests are, there's clearly some very basic get to know you communication things that are not happening. So that to me in the very best sense, this is what Father Sanchi is trying to do. And I'm not sure I entirely buy it, but I'm like, sure, in the broader sense, great, but we have some more basic work to do.
Tom?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I totally agree. Well-intentioned, I think, if you're looking for some kind of model or some kind of concept to, in a perfect world, or, to hope that would characterize the relationship between bishop and priest, I guess sort of in a classroom and a textbook, you could think of it that way, but there is a huge disconnect, and if I'm not mistaken, that was probably the biggest disconnect in the study, I think, between how bishops perceive themselves as acting as spiritual fathers, priests not so much. Do priests want that of their bishop? Maybe some do. I mean, that's, that would be kind of a fascinating question to pursue. But I think the answer for a lot of priests, I think, is no. I have no reason to, spiritual fatherhood entails, depending on how you understand it, I think you have to be very careful with the concept, especially with priests in ministry. And but, that entails a kind of self-disclosure with potentially with the bishop that is neither necessary or called for, or many priests would be inclined to these days. So I think it's quite possible that with 2002, 2003 with the Dallas Charter, we've kind of probably lost something there that maybe is, I don't know that we can really recover it. I don't know that we need to recover it. I think most of us as priests would be very happy to have a bishop who, yes, knows me. I think that's a huge thing. I want my bishop to know me. I don't need to relate, for that to happen, I don't need to relate to him as a spiritual father or him to me. But yes, knowledge. I think that's one of the most basic fundamental needs there, and sometimes even that is lacking. I want, yes, someone who will, that I can confide in when necessary, that I can trust has my back. But that's where the things can get, we can run into troubled waters, right?
So it's generally recognized, I think, that something broke in 2002. Something broke between the trust of bishops and priests with the promulgation of the Dallas Charter and the essential norms, and again, not only the way in which they were implemented, but the way in which both of them were structured.
And there's an essay in the book at that end that is a little bit strong, but
Yeah.
absolutely.
I'm not sure it's strong enough.
There you go.
So something, if it's true that something broke there, was it trust, or was it something deeper than that or broader than that? And if we can't identify it, can we try to recover it?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question is, if we can identify it, should it be recovered? Was it a healthy relationship in the first place?
Sure. Can I just add parentheses to open the parentheses? I mean, we've talked about this a lot, and I think we all realize this too, but this isn't true just of clerical culture. I think it goes broader than that in the church. We are living, I think, in a remarkable moment of a breakdown of trust. Okay. It's just hard for anybody to trust anybody. I just came back from a visitation of a seminary in Central American country, and biggest problem, I interviewed 26 seminarians, to a man. Biggest problem, I don't trust my formators. I don't. So do seminarians trust their formators? Can priests trust their bishops? Can parishioners trust their pastors? Can I trust the people who work down at the chancery? This is a big problem. I mean, I think there's solutions, but I think we just need to put it in that broader context.
Well, and it extends beyond the church. Not only does it extend beyond clerical society, I mean, this is, again, I think, at least within the American context, if you read, from Watergate forward, the trust in institutions in general is lost. So, and again, the clerical experience is a trust within an institution because we know the inside of the institution better. So I know that my future literally depends on my bishop. So that my lack of trust in my bishop necessarily creates a disquiet within me because I know that he holds my future in his hands, whatever decisions that he makes. So if I can't be confident in, and again, as you and I have discussed in the past, it's like I don't need him to be a spiritual father. I need him to be consistent.
Yes.
What do I need in a relationship? I need an expectation of consistency. That when my bishop is confronted with a problem or an issue, that I know that this is how he's going to respond, regardless of the priest that's involved. Is there a consistency that again, for me, it's a very low bar, I know, but I don't think we have that. And if we don't have consistency, then there's no way to have trust because I don't know what my bishop's reaction is going to be to any piece of information that he receives about me or about another priest or about, does he trust the report of one parishioner over another parishioner? Does he trust the word of one priest over another? I can't have trust if we don't have that consistency. But again, the question is, so if we again, 2002 is an easy date to point to because statistically we know this is where the wheels fall off the trust bus when it comes to priests and bishops because of the dramatic change in relationship.
Trust us, I like that.
So there's a dramatic change in relationship between bishops and priests around Dallas Charter and the essential norms. So do we think there's any way to recover that level of trust that existed before? Or was that trust was there a false impression of trust that we didn't realize was false until it was put to the fire, put into the test of Dallas?
And to answer that, I'd say partially yes, and partly a false understanding of trust. I, acknowledge in my chapter a lot of the trust that priests self-profess had in their bishops was misplaced. Why? Handling of sex abuse cases and some frankly immoral and disgusting actions on the part of priests and bishops in their handling of the issues. One thing that particularly stuck out to me, especially in that time period that I talk about in the chapter, is there was a perception, these younger priests loved for John Paul II, that if my bishop isn't the greatest guy in the world, he can be reined in by Rome, by the Metropolitan, by whomever. And they had specific examples of that in the early 80s.
You pointed to Hunt House.
Yeah, the Hunt House and issues in Seattle where a successor was literally about to be put in place after Hunthausen retired because of his poor handling of liturgical issues in the diocese and different personnel issues, not to say the sexual abuse issues. And that didn't end up working out the way that the John Paul II would have preferred. we can even say the imposition of a Father General for the Society of Jesus in the early 80s. That was another one of those efforts. Again, didn't work out quite as well as John Paul might have preferred. But I think as a partial answer to that question, that's one thing that's missing since John Paul is we don't really have that much confidence that if my bishop is behaving poorly, that Rome will kind of put a stop to this, or that I can even appeal to what the Holy See is doing in their own efforts towards, say, sex abuse, financial reform, that they are doing what needs to be done. I can no longer do that after 2002.
So beyond, again, it's easy to point to that because again, there's statistical evidence that points to this is a critical moment of the breakdown in trust between priests and bishops in the US. But are there other factors that you think that go beyond the clerical sexual abuse crisis? Are there other things in the life of the church in the US that have contributed to this?
Well, I mean, obviously, the abuse crisis itself, we know that was the bottom fell out, I think, of the credibility of bishops and along with them priests. So I think we're still dealing with that as well. And yeah, I mean, that was a huge wake-up call when we realized the extent of the mishandling of cases. So that in itself, I think, has contributed enormously also to this breakdown of trust. To say something hopeful, no, I think it's also remarkable to me how trust can be built. The saying that all politics is local, I mean, I still find that in the parish, when people know you and they, I mean, it's still, even today, it's not that difficult to build an atmosphere of trust. In seminary formation, the building of a culture of trust, you can find that literally as a bullet point on like a seminary program of formation, so that the seminary formation team knows that going in, we have to be doing a series of things to build a culture of trust among the men. And if we can do that, then good things can happen, So it just takes very intentional efforts, I think, at the parish level, in the seminary, at the chancery, it's and then going back to priests and bishops. Yes, that's a two-way street. So we got to get over if bishops are, forgive me, but living a bit in la la land, that they're a spiritual bother to all their priests. Okay, well, we need to get past that and realize, okay, well, no, that's not actually the case. How about if we sit down and talk about this? How about if we sit down, with the presbyter and actually talk about your relationship with us? And can we be vulnerable with each other and have that kind of conversation? Because vulnerability is where you start building trust, when we can actually be vulnerable with each other, and that's another whole huge issue. But it's a topic very much in my heart. But I do think it is possible. So we can't. It's not just, well, we've got to break down trust and we're all kind of a mess. I mean, we need to proactively start recovering that.
And I think too, I mean, again, small steps. I mean, this is again very isolated incidents, but when people like you or I are called by a bishop to address the presbyterate, or to work with the men. I mean, I've been asked by several dioceses, by several bishops, pick up the phone, call me, like, JP, we know there have been changes to the law. I want you to come and explain them to my priests so that they understand their rights and they understand where they're at risk, what they could be held responsible for. So even, I mean, again, small efforts through education, when Bishop, again, it demonstrates to his priests that he is concerned about them and he wants them to understand what their responsibilities are in a concrete way. And one of the other examples that the book, and just to sort of close up before we open up for questions, one of the other examples in the book about a recommended mechanism, if you will, for helping to restore trust was the figure of the vicar for clergy. And, whether
That was interesting.
whether this would be, again, a reinforced or reinvigorated or a beefed up image of, sort of bulked up vicar for clergy could be an effective tool to help restore trust between a bishop and his presbyterate. Brooke, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that recommendation.
Actually, that's what I wanted to hear, especially from Father Tom about being a diocesan priest. My primary, the way I sort of enter my understanding of authority and sort of episcopal action in the church is through my experience with religious orders, because that's how it was formed. I tend to think I literally have to stop and remind myself that a bishop is different from, a Jesuit father provincial, because that is sort of my idea of the way authority works. So help me out here.
Well, I mean, if the idea is that a vicar for clergy would kind of mediate the contact between priest and bishop, just from the get-go, I don't think that's a good model. I think bishops need to be accessible, meaning that, and I personally come off just a wonderful experience of that with my outgoing Cardinal Archbishop, Cardinal Dolan. Just an enormous degree of accessibility for whoever wanted it. So I think just that availability is huge. Now obviously there's different models of governance, there's different styles, but I just think bishops would be very wary if contact with their clergy has to come through a vicar for whatever, I'm not a fan of that model.
And my concerns would be, again, because the vicar for clergy is not a role that is defined. It's the bishop. The bishop decides what his vicar for clergy does or doesn't do.
You're a vicar, which means you are delegated some sort of authority canonically.
Yeah,
and I can define what that is between dioceses.
And it's a role that operates differently. And in as many different dioceses as we have in the U.S., there are that many different models of vicar for clergy, in our country. And I think my concern would be something more akin to the difficulty that we experience in formation of the mixing of the internal and external forum. Because some bishops use vicar for clergy almost in a spiritual role, so that he becomes the point of entry into the mechanism of authority for a priest who finds himself in what he defines as spiritual, in a spiritually rough place, or with information that would be sensitive if it left the internal forum. And that scares me even more than the sort of the mediation between the priests, because then this vicar for clergy is operating in no man's land, because he has information that should be bound to the internal forum when his role is one that is in the external forum. So it's I know, Father Tom, is a problem that you've witnessed in the realm of formation, and I'm afraid that that's a problem that has been transferred onto this role outside of seminary. So again, I'm really hesitant of it too, but because it's neither fish nor fowl. And if the role were properly defined, if it were not a mediation but were a vehicle of encouragement and strengthening of the relationship of the priest with one another and with the bishop, then I think that would be great. But then the vicar for clergy is a cheerleader.
Exactly.
And I don't know that that's, I don't know what that's supposed to be. So, Dr. Tranten, do you have any closing thoughts before we open up for questions? Or
I think, just my closing thought here would be, I think the through line of, especially the latter part of our conversation, is what we're looking for really is consistency, and the consistency of our relationships with one another in the church, vis-a-vis priests and bishops, in the implementation of diocesan policy related to sex abuse, most clearly. And I also what I did in my chapter, I sort of laid all of this, want of consistency at the feet of bishops. It's the bishops who really need to be entering into this conversation of that position of vulnerability, trying to rebuild relationships with their priests and, religious superiors and religious. Simply because they are on the stronger side, the asymmetry. And frankly, they hold all the power over their priests. And, I don't mean this as a browbeating sort of thing. I mean this as a call to, a call to further discernment and a call to really just sit down and think about and look at the people around you and say, okay, how do I rebuild these relationships on the part of the bishops? And I know that's kind of a simple answer, and it's very easy to, tell the bishops they should do this when there's not a bishop in the room. But it's a call to strengthening the presbyterate and to the rebuilding trust and rebuilding the body of Christ that way.
So any questions? We have some time left and hopefully some rich questions from the floor.
Say a bit more, Brooke, about this difference in the trust levels between diocesan clergy and religious. Why do you think that is? I think I wrote down 49% for diocesan, 67% for religious.
And this is why I brought up the numbers, thanks, Father Bill. So that's a good reminder for me. Well, I think the reason is religious communities tend to be smaller. The presbyterate is just smaller. There tends to be much more close, more of a close relationship with the superior. And there's just more overall, I would say, there's just more relationship built on the part of religious than there is in many, many cases for the diocesan priesthood. Religious priests tend to have less responsibility than maybe diocesans do, certainly less parish work in the United States. So you're going to see sort of lower levels of stress, higher levels of trust, just from that point of view. So I really do think it comes down to relationship there. And if I am a part of a religious community, I have a built-in support system. Whereas if I'm a diocesan priest, I very well might not. If I'm thrown out on the street, tomorrow, I quite literally can't be as religious. So I think those are some of the factors at play. Just really simple human reasons of why those levels of trust are higher.
Perhaps there's some connection between a religious superior who's going to exercise that office only for a limited period of time, and then he will return into being someone who has somebody above him. There's a different leadership structure with limited terms for leadership. Maybe that has something to do with it.
And I think too the experience of leadership
to office don't feel they have some input into who would be their authority figure.
Absolutely.
Christian.
Forgive me if this was discussed at all, but I wanted to know if any of you had thoughts of whether the data set you talked about, Brooke, does it talk about the size of the diocese? I know there was a Pillar article about a year ago that talked about increased vocations in smaller mid-sized dioceses. Do you think this is something that could help the church, especially as we're hearing more about diocesan mergers than we are separations, so to speak? Is this something that could benefit?
That's a great question, Christian. Thank you. So yes, the study does have an entire section about levels of trust and size of diocese. It tends to be, and I don't have the numbers directly in front of me, but they're, literal graphs in the study for this. The larger the diocese, the lower the levels of trust. I wonder why. If I have over 500 priests in my archdiocese, that's much more difficult if I'm a bishop to get to know my priests than if I have a presbyterate of less than 100. I'm in the Diocese of Maine or something, But, so yes, that sort of intuition is correct. However, it is not, according to the data in the study, it is not a huge predictor of levels of trust in priests, which is very, very interesting, because it's very easy for us to be like, oh, well, it's too hard to call 500 priests on their birthday, right? It's much easier if it's less than 100. Yes, but the single greatest predictor in the study of whether or not a priest trusts their bishop or religious superior is, do I feel like my bishop cares about me? That had a much higher ratio of prediction than did the size of the diocese. But the size of the diocese certainly does matter, so the instinct is right there.
Can I just say, I thank you for zeroing in on that, but I think that single factor, just speaking as a diocesan priest, to know that my bishop actually cares for me, that he actually cares, that's decisive, that's huge. And not for nothing, Cardinal Dolan, forgive me, but every one of us on our birthday, phone call.
And it can be done, in a large presbyterate, right? I think of on that end, Cardinal O'Connor, who had basically visiting hours every Wednesday. No appointments on the books. Any priest who wants to see me can come right through the door every Wednesday that he possibly could, and he wasn't traveling. So it can be done. And that's not and you don't mean necessarily in a sentimental way.
And the same, there's also good evidence, again, to go back to the sex abuse crisis. There's also really good evidence that the bishops that had a similar policy to Cardinal O'Connor's with their own faithful, that their relationship within the diocese, when they were the ones that met with victims, when they were the ones that received them, when they were the ones that engaged, when the bishops were, that they had, again, as a concrete outcome, a significantly lower settlement expense than dioceses that didn't do that, because they took a very pastoral stance toward these victims of abuse, and that helped to maintain and restore that trust with the faithful as well. So I think this is an easy mechanism that works not only internally with priests, but also externally with the faithful when a bishop has that, again, to use the word vulnerability, but availability, I would say. Availability and interest. Ken?
Dr. Tranten, you mentioned that this study was done in 2021-22 is when they were asking the clergy.
Yes.
So of course, that was also a very interesting time in which the church had been shut down due to COVID. And a lot of priests experienced great stress over that, priests and the faithful, of course, all of us. But I'm really kind of interested also in that was 7 years into the pontificate of Pope Francis, which you spoke about the stability that we had under John Paul II in the 2000 study. Francis, of course, has cases, that are still unresolved, the Marco Rupnik case, and of course, financial irregularities and things like that. So you talked about these sorts of questions that keep clergy and bishops were not even sure what Rome was doing itself, let alone, that inconsistency. So I'm wondering if, there are two parts there. One is COVID and all that happened with that part of this self-reporting, lack of trust? And are the bishops also not themselves knowing what will happen when they appeal to Rome or try to get a question out of Rome?
Yeah, those are very good questions. I can't remember off the top of my head if there was a COVID question asked, at least in the 2025 follow-up study. I feel like there was, but I might be confusing that with the Synod on Synodality question.
Well, wait, bring up another question.
That's look at the data. It is exactly what you might think it is, which is kind of great for a lot of the data in this in this study. It's for those of us with very strong confirmation biases of the way we think the church looks in the United States. A lot of our preconceived notions were just proved true, so that's nice. But that second part of your question, Ken, consistency either on the part of Rome as seen by the bishops, that's very interesting, because I think based on what we have been looking at is I can see the facial expression. It's just not a word out of these two. It would largely be reflected by that of their priests. So here we go. We have a triangle of distrust: Rome, the bishops, and the priests.
And the faithful.
And the faithful too. So a square. Yes, thanks, Lauren. Appreciate it.
So we have time for one more question. Go ahead.
So I was just curious if the levels of trust in the survey were at all able to be correlated with whether or not there was like a more or less active diocesan tribunal, like if they were like more actively trying to employ and implement canon law, that was for like higher or lower level of trust, because that seems like a really practical way of the bishop establishing consistency in how he lives.
So short answer, no. No, and Monsignor, would that be helpful?
So I think
Are they taking statistics on?
no, not this is the other problem. I mean, you could respond to certain questions, but you can't offer specific numbers. But you could say, we are, yes, this is, we are actively treating this, or we're actively treating that, or these are the processes that we put in place when we receive this request. All of that kind of stuff could be examined without getting into the nitty-gritty of the numbers. But I think what would be very curious in this time period, again, going back to the observation of the unpredictability of Rome and of what a Roman response would be, I can certainly tell you that there is the experience of tribunals in the United States of America, at least in penal cases, where there had been, I can use the past tense now, there had been some leeriness, a little bit of hesitance, because of the fear of the unpredictable response that might come on appeal were it to go to Rome, because you had a number of factors. You had, again, there's a very famous case in the state of Indiana regarding a particular high school in a particular archdiocese, where we know that
Of a particular religious
order, where we know that the Holy Father, who also happened to be of that particular religious order, intervened personally and prevented the case from moving forward toward adjudication, so that Rome was told not to respond. Rome was going to respond in one way and then was begged not to respond because that response would have influenced the litigation that was going on in the courts, which was important for establishing principles of religious liberty under U.S. law. So it's extraordinarily complicated in that sense, and I think the degree of or the lack of predictability, under the last pontificate when it came to certain questions, led to hesitance in the application of the law.
And is that case is still, as of right now, still at the Dicastery for Education,
where it will continue to be for the foreseeable future. Well, I think we're out of time. So Dr. Tranten, thank you very much for your work, for your study, for your participation, and for your explanation to all of us of this important work toward rebuilding trust And thanks to Father Tom for all of his, again, this has been, obviously, if you can't tell, the three of us have had this conversation several times. So we've enjoyed it very much. We've had rich conversations, and it's been an honor to share that with all of you. So again, thank you.
Thank you.